we go. On your lined piece of paper, we're going to draw a flowchart for classifying numbers. We've been working a lot on classifying numbers, and this is a strategy we haven't used. So we're going to try something new. I'm going to start in the center middle in the top of my page, right? So here's my paper, just to zoom out for a second to show you where I'm starting. I'm going to start right in the top in the middle, and I'm going to end up using the whole page. So just be aware of your space and kind of keep it the same as mine. So we're going to be talking about real numbers. Go ahead and box that. All numbers are real numbers, or there are such things as imaginary numbers, but you haven't learned about them yet, and you don't need to worry about them, not in Algebra 1. So when we start with a number that we're trying to classify, right, like the number 5, the first thing we know is it's a real number. And then after that, we need to start asking ourselves questions in order to classify it. So the first question we ask ourselves is whether it's rational or irrational. Now, we've just discussed this. We've just talked about this, right? And so we've talked about the difference between rational and irrational. But basically, is it a non-ending, non-repeating decimal? This is the only kind of number that's irrational. So that's the first question you're going to ask yourself. And if the answer is yes, then what you have is an irrational number. Okay, and remember those numbers. Let's just talk about what irrational numbers look like, right? That's pi. That's the square root of a number like 3 that doesn't have a whole number square root, or a number like 10. Okay, those are irrational numbers. And if your number is irrational, you're done. You've classified your number, right? Let's say you were classifying the number square root of 7. Then the square root of 7 is real, and it's irrational, and that's it. That's all it is. Now, if you answer this question, is it a non-ending, non-repeating decimal, and you said no, well, in that case, your number is rational. Right? And the rational numbers look like everything else besides these sort of odd numbers that we don't see too much. Now, if it is rational, then there's a lot of other words we use to describe rational numbers. So let's get more specific. The next question you want to ask yourself is, does it have a fraction or decimal part? Right, so the number 5.3, it has a fraction or a decimal. So you would answer yes. If you were doing the number 2, right, that does not have a fraction or decimal part, then you would answer no. Now, if you answer yes, then you're done. Okay, if you answer yes, and your number is, for example, 5.3, then your number is real, it is rational, and it is nothing else, right? 5.3 is just a real rational number, and there's no other words we use to describe it. However, if you said no, if your number is, let's say, -7, it doesn't have a fraction or a decimal, then that means it is also an integer. So far, let's say I'm working with the number -7. Then I know my number is real, it's rational, and it's also an integer. Okay. Now, the next thing we want to talk about is whether it's positive or negative. So the next question you're going to ask yourself is it negative? Is your number negative? Okay, you're asking yourself a lot of questions here. Now, if it's negative, and your answer to this question is yes, in that case, you're done. If, like the number -7, we have no other words to describe it besides real, rational, and integer. So -7 is real, rational, integer, and nothing else. Okay, I'm going to scoot my page up a little bit. Now, if it's not negative, if your answer is not negative, then your number is also a whole number. So let's say you're working with the number 5. So far for number 5, we know our answer is real, it's rational, it's an integer, and it's a whole number. Okay, and we have one more question to ask ourselves. The question is it 0? Is your number the number 0? And if the answer is yes, then you're done. The number 0 is real, rational, integer, and whole. If your answer is no, what that means is that your number is a positive number. Oops, sorry, you didn't see that last part. Let me just review that last part because I was off camera. If I was working with the number 0, I would start at the top. I know it's a real number. It's also a rational number. It's also an integer. It's also a whole number. Okay, and so now, if it's not 0, what that means is if it's not negative and it's not 0, it's some positive number like 7 or 8 or 20, right? It doesn't have a fraction or decimal. It's not negative. It's not 0. And what that means is that it is also a natural number. And if it's a natural number, that's as specific as we get, and we are done. So notice with this flowchart, let's zoom out, take a look at it. We're done no matter which way we go at some point. The question is just, how many words are we going to describe our number with before we're totally done, right? And so in some cases, our number is just real and irrational, or real and rational. In some cases, our number is real, rational, integer, whole, and natural, okay? But we start with all numbers are real numbers, and then every number is either rational or irrational. So in any answer you give, the word real should be first, and then the next word should be either rational or irrational. And then if it's rational, there may be more words that we use to describe it as well. Let's go ahead and practice this. I'm going to do one, just as an example of using the flowchart, and then we're going to do some on the bottom of our page and actually try to classify some numbers like you did on the quiz. So I'm going to classify the number -4. So, and I'm going to write it at the bottom, but I'm also just going to speak it so I can look at the flowchart at the same time, and then I'll show you what I wrote at the end. So if I'm classifying the number -4, the first thing is I know it's a real number. I'm going to write real. I know you can't see it, but I'll scoot it up in a moment. So I know it's real. Now, I need to decide whether it's rational or irrational. So I ask, is it a non-ending, non-repeating decimal? Well, no, it's not. So it's also rational. I'm going to write the word rational. So I'm here. Next question, does it have a fraction or decimal? And it doesn't. The number -4 doesn't, so I say no. So that means it's also an integer. So then I ask, is it negative? Well, yes, it is. And so I'm done. So for the number -4, it's real, it's rational, and it's an integer. Go ahead and try. And you may have written a little bit bigger than me, and you may need to flip your paper over to do this. This is totally fine. But go ahead and try these numbers. Sorry, I'll trick you with the camera here. Go ahead and classify those numbers, and then once you've done it, come back and check your answers. So pause now and try it. Okay, you should have paused and tried this. I'm just going to go ahead and real quick fill out the answers. You can go back to your flowchart, and you can also ask for help, of course, if you need help. The number 3, real, rational, integer, right? Then I ask, is it negative? It's no, so it's also whole. Is it 0? No, it's also natural. For 0, start at real. It's also rational. It's also an integer. It's also whole, but when I ask, is it 0? The answer is yes, and it is not a natural number. Square root of 7. It's definitely real. But this square root of 7, it's not a number that's a whole number, and so we know that square roots, when they're not a whole number, they become that non-ending, non-repeating decimal, and that's an irrational number. 5.3, it's real. I ask myself, is it a non-ending, non-repeating decimal? Well, it's a decimal, but it's not non-ending and non-repeating. It's just a regular decimal, so that's rational. But when I ask myself, does it have a fraction or a decimal? Yes, it does, and I'm done. So these are your answers. Feel free to ask questions now, or also feel free if you would like to raise your hand and get some more examples to try. That's fine too. But right now, you're done with this video, and you can go on to whatever you're doing next.